Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, I know it's been a minute. I've been MIA. I've been really busy. But I did go back and I am grabbing a game between Wesley and Nihal Sarin. This is game, if I'm not mistaken, 21 out of their match that they just played a few days ago. For anybody, as I always say, that wants to skip right to the analysis, I do have it timestamped at the very top of the description, so go ahead and click that. For everybody else, I appreciate you guys very much for coming by. For all of my people that come from the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kumusta na aking mga kaibigan? Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Hello, you lit. Magandang umaga, magandang hapon. I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by and taking a look at my stuff. Anybody who is coming from India or who does speak Malayalam, I will say namaskaram to you and Nandi for coming by and taking a look at my stuff. And I did say that I was going to speak Greek. None of you guys heard me say this. I was talking to somebody and they are from Greece. So I'm going to try to say this without looking at my thing. And you know what's funny? I actually know a few Greek people that I worked with at the airport. And I do remember him telling me to say hello. And he was like, it's just yes. I was like, oh, really? It's yes? That's like yes in English. But what I learned was yesas. I believe that's the more formal way to say it. Thank you. It is eforisto. So appreciate you guys very much. Anybody who is coming from Greece. So I will have to send this video to my people in Greece. My guys, there's two brothers I used to work with. Yes. If you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. All right. So we got knight to f3. We got d5. And this opening is going to become very special for me because this is actually what I play myself. We got c4, e6, d4. Knight comes to f6. We got g3. Bishop to e7. Bishop to g2. Castles and then castles. And we do have the Catalan opening. And I get into this position 50 billion times a day. No, I'm just playing. But we do have pawn taking c4. And you have a few different ways that you can go about, trying to get this pawn back. What we actually see in the game is queen to c2. But, you have knight coming to e5 as possible. And it probably just gets you in a situation where the knight does come here to c6. And you get into that game. You also have queen coming to a4. That's another option that you have. Those are going to be by far the most heavily played moves, with queen to c2 coming in at number 1. So like I said, that is what we do see in the game. We got b5. You are opening up this diagonal, so be very careful. But you are making an attempt to try to, keep the pawn that you did capture. So it's a double-edged sword. So we do have a4, trying to break down that protection of that pawn. We got b4, knight f to d2. Knight comes to d5, and then now we do finally get our pawn back. Something had to give, because after the knight did come down to d2, knight f to d2, we did discover an attack on this undefended bishop on a8. So after we have knight taking c4, we do have c5. Like I always say, your opponent is going to be trying to break down your position as much as possible. This is an ideal pawn. You definitely don't want to allow e4 to get played, because it will be knocking this knight somewhere, and you can push d5, and you can continue to try to discover attacks on this rook. So you got to try to play it as safe as possible. So pawn takes c5. We see bishop down to a6, trying to counterattack the knight. But we are also trying to x-ray a little bit because this can become a very big weakness for white, the e2 point, because you don't normally have anything protecting this pawn early on in the game. Knight comes to e3. We see knight to d7. Knight takes d5. We got pawn taking d5. And then we do see the novelty of the game, which is bishop to e3. Wesley is just saying that he really does not want to give away this pawn. It is a passed pawn, so if you can hold on to it, you're better for it. What's best for white in this position is actually just to go c6 to further advance the pawn. You definitely have some possibilities of capturing here. So after the knight would come possibly to c5, you can double attack the knight with bishop to e3, and then if you try to block, With d4, you actually have rook over to d1. This is actually pretty good for white. It's not bad the way it was played already, but that was just an alternative that we can do. So after the bishop came to e3, we did see rook over to c8, and you can see that the pressure is insanely built on this point. So we're looking kind of iffy on this far advanced pawn. So we do see bishop to h3, trying to pin down this knight, definitely making it, you know, a little, you know, uncomfortable for you to try to move this knight because you would be dropping the exchange on this rook. So we do see d4, bishop takes d4, bishop comes back to b7. We see rook over to d1. And as I always tell you guys, it is always a good idea. I mean, I don't want to say always. Sometimes it's not. It's rare. But a majority of the time, it's good for you to put a rook opposite a queen or a king because there's always some type of discoveries that could possibly happen. So we do sidestep that with queen to c7, and we have actually reached the point in the game that if you don't want to pause the video and see what Wesley So, what tactical shot Wesley So finds in this position, go ahead and do so. Okay, cool. So I was telling you guys already that, you know, putting the rook opposite a queen is always a good idea. Something that you probably should notice in this position is you do have this rook and this bishop both trained on this d7 point, which is where the knight is. If you could just get this bishop out of the way. What better thing to do in this position than to discover an attack with bishop takes g7. So if you found a bishop takes g7, then you are pretty good tactically. You only have to be careful because black actually has a nice in-between move that they can put, and that is queen to c6. You know, why not threaten checkmate? I always tell you guys all the time, if you can threaten checkmate, you usually can gain some tempi. And this is one of those situations because, you know, checkmate is on h1 if you allow it to be. So we do see h4, you know, tossing you know, the pawn in the way. And, you know, we're not worried about this here because after the queen takes, bishop takes, we are just taking this knight for completely free. So you got to be careful about that. So the rook sidesteps over rook f to d8. We see bishop back down to d4. So we're trying to add a little bit of protection onto this pawn. We do see rook down to c7. As I'll tell you guys as well, you do want to be careful when you do this, though, because this diagonal, it's not vulnerable at the moment, but you have seen situations where you can get your rooks pinned to each other, and that's not very great. So the knight comes up to d2, finally developing itself. The knight does take on c5. We see bishop to e5, attacking on a different diagonal with the rook. The knight comes down to d3. We see queen taking c6, rook taking c6. We see knight over to f3. Rook comes down to c2. It's always a good idea to try to get a rook on this 7th rank. It's pretty strong. The rook does take on d3. And this move might look kind of crazy at first. You're thinking, wait a minute, why are you taking on d3 with the rook? You're just dropping the exchange. Well, white is actually going to get that exchange back. And the reason why he took on d3 is to set the rooks up on this. It doesn't necessarily have to be a diagonal, but for the knight's sake. After the rook takes on d3, this rook takes d3, you actually have knight down to e1, and you are going to be getting your exchange back. So, I mean, there was a method to the madness. So the rook comes down to rook d to d2. You take on c2 with the knight, the rook takes on c2. You do have bishop down to d4. And you are up quite a few pawns as white. Black only has 4 pawns. You have 6 entire pawns. You are going to be dropping this pawn right here with bishop to e4, but you're not actually dropping pawns because you have now lined up both of your bishops. And I feel like you guys should see it. Rook over to e1. And one of these bishops has to go. You don't really have black trapped at the moment, you know, because you do have your own weaknesses. So, you know, you might be thinking if I could just put the bishop here, it could take here, you know, maybe I'll be looking at a checkmating situation, but a white would actually be just a little bit faster. If we did see the bishop coming to f3, we would see the rook taking here, and you can block here after the rook to c1, and you do not have time as black to checkmate because you are looking at rook to e8 mate. So you cannot do that. So like I said, after we saw rook over to e1, we tried to protect with f5, but you actually have 2 different ways that you can exploit this. I guess maybe bishop taking here is not a move for some reason. Seems like it would be. Maybe it's not. It's not showing. It actually is, but it's like showing it's like really, really bad. Well, not bad, but it's not the greatest. Anyway, we do see F5, and then we have F3, which is like the cleanest way to go about doing this. The bishop takes on F3, and then we do see rook taking E7, as you can see. White is just up an entire piece. And they do have equal pawns, but I mean, it's a piece, man. The bishop comes back over to E4. Anytime you're playing against the rook with the bishop, you do want to try to make sure that your bishop is anchored somewhere. So after the bishop comes down to F1, we see B3. We got rook taking A7. Now another pawn drops. We see the king over to F8, and we do see A5. And there isn't any good stuff to do here for black. I mean, this pawn is held down. There is no penetration here as far as the check is concerned. This rook has the ability just to swing across the board. And this pawn is pretty unstoppable. There's not really a good way to get the rook in protection of this square. So it is in this position that Nihal Sarin does resign the game. And if any of you guys that did watch that match, they know that Wesley So barely won. I think he won by just 1 game or 2 games, if I'm not mistaken. So it was a very, very close fight. And Nihal Sarin definitely gave Wesley So a run for his money on that one. So we're looking at the semifinals coming up. So I appreciate you guys very much for coming by. Maraming salamat aking kaibigan. Nandi and Efaristo for anybody who is coming from Greece or who does speak Greek. I appreciate you guys very much, and I will see y'all next time.